think about endodontics, the first thing that usually comes to mind is root canal treatment. But there's a little bit more to it than that. Let's kick things off with an introduction to dentin and pulp biology. Alright guys, at this point in your journey to becoming a dentist, you should be very familiar with the components of a tooth. We have our outer enamel layer, our underlying dentin layer, and finally we have the pulp chamber which houses the pulp. Now we have to remember that the pulp and dentin function as a unit. The pulp is dependent upon the protection provided by the dentin and enamel. Now the actual dynamics of the pulp-dentin complex are more appreciated when we think about an insult to the dentin that affects the pulp. For example, when we have a deep carious lesion which causes the pulp to recede. Conversely, disturbances in the dental pulp can also affect the quantity and quality of the dentin produced. Again, an example of this would be a genetic mutation affecting the odontoblasts that are found in the pulp, leading to disorders like dentinogenesis imperfecta. Needless to say, the pulp is the lifeline of the tooth. So let's take a closer look into what makes it so unique. For starters, it is completely surrounded by hard tissue, dentin, which means that it has limited available room for expansion. Okay, so what? Why is that important? Well, since it has limited room, the pulp can't tolerate edema or inflammation. It's horrible at dealing with these things actually. Any acute inflammation that causes swelling will lead to an increase in pressure in the pulp chamber, which leads to the stimulation of pulp nerves to record pain. Alright, secondly, the pulp lacks collateral circulation. This is something most students don't think about, but really, the blood supplying a tooth can only really enter through the root apex. So most teeth have only one passageway for nutrients. Molar teeth are a bit luckier in that they are multi-rooted, meaning there's generally more than one passageway to the pulp. But what's important here is that this limitation in circulation means that the pulp generally has a difficult time fighting infections and inflammation as opposed to other tissues in our body that have ample collateral circulation. Because remember guys, increased blood circulation doesn't just mean more available nutrients, but also more available white blood cells that are crucial for fighting infections and inflammation. Okay, the last point I want to mention touches on the unique composition of cells within the pulp. Undoubtedly, this is what makes the dental pulp special. We have unique hard tissue secreting cells. We have odontoblasts, which we all know are responsible for producing dentin, but we also have mesenchymal cells, which I like to view as the godparents of the pulp because they really step up to protect the pulp from injury when things go wrong, such as when a tooth becomes carious or is taking a beating from bruxism. When these things happen, these mesenchymal stem cells differentiate into cells that form other types of dentin. Now, there are actually a lot more cell types contained within the pulp, so we're now going to expand on point number 3 a bit more. So as mentioned previously, the pulp is composed of a variety of cells and connective tissues. We have loose connective fibrous tissue that fills in the spaces between cells and the neurovascular bundle, and we have the neurovascular bundle itself, which contains blood vessels, lymph nodes, and nerves. And finally, we have our various cell types. We have odontoblasts, which produce primary and secondary dentin. We have our mesenchymal cells, which can differentiate into secondary odontoblasts to produce reparative dentin in response to injury. We also have fibroblasts, which produce the fibrous tissue that I just talked about. And finally, we have immune cells, such as macrophages and dendritic cells. All of these cells have their own role in the pulp, and collectively, they function in tooth development, pulp homeostasis, injury response, and dentin pulp regeneration. Okay, now let's go just a bit deeper and look at the arrangement of these cells, or what we refer to as the histological zones of the pulp. The first zone we will talk about is the odontoblastic zone, which is directly subjacent to the predentin and dentin layers. Alright guys, important thing to remember is that the predentin is just the unmineralized inner dentin layer, and the odontoblast processes shown here pass through the predentin into the inner part of the dentin, as you see in the illustration. Alright, so zone 1, the odontoblastic zone, again just represents the outermost cells of the healthy pulp and is located immediately subjacent to the predentin. Zone 2 is the cell-free zone, also known as the zone of Weil. This is a narrow zone that is actually relatively free of cell nuclei, as the name implies, and instead it is traversed by blood capillaries, unmyelinated nerve fibers, and cell processes. Zone 3 is the cell-rich zone, which, again, as the name implies, contains a relatively high proportion of cells, and really all the ones I mentioned earlier. We have the fibroblasts, the immune cells, and even the mesenchymal cells. Finally, we have the pulp core. This zone contains the Raschkow plexus of nerves and the main blood vessels in the pulp.